Thank you for joining us for this webinar session. My name is Ayman Chaudhary, and I am the Head of Secretariat of the Global Compact Network Canada. For those who are not familiar with our organization, Global Compact Network Canada is the Canadian organization of the UN Global Compact. UN Global Compact is the largest corporate sustainability initiative in the world and dedicated to assisting organizations to adopt sustainable business practices by committing to 10 principles around human rights, anti-corruption, labor, and environment. Also, since the launch of the Sustainable Development Goals, in short, the SDGs in 2015, one of our key mandate is also to support the private sector to contribute to the goals. SDG number 5, which is to eliminate all forms of discrimination and violence against women in public and private domains, and to understand reforms to give women equal rights to economic resources and access to ownership of property. This SDG has always been one of the top 3 priorities of the Canadian organizations as found in our SDG survey reports. However, the challenges of the Canadian organizations as found in our is multifold, and it requires sincere and dedicated commitment from the business leaders in an enabling environment. To guide any organizations looking to advance gender equality, we developed a blueprint for gender equality leadership in Canada. The blueprint has been created in partnership with the Department for Women and Gender Equality of the Government of Canada. And this blueprint is a comprehensive tool that contains information, recommendations, best practices from the Canadian companies, and resources to help organizations and individuals advance gender equality and learn more about what workplace inclusion should look like. The blueprint can be used by any organizations looking to implement solutions to systematic, cultural, and institutional barriers that must be addressed in order to achieve gender equality in the workplace. We also have recently launched Target Gender Equality Program, which is a year-long accelerator program for participating companies of the UN Global Compact to set and reach ambitious corporate targets for women representation and leadership. Through facilitated performance analysis, capacity building workshops, peer-to-peer learning, and multi-stakeholder dialogue at the country level, companies can deepen the implementation of women empowerment principles and strengthen their contribution to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goal, particularly target number 5.5, which calls for women's full participation and equal opportunities for leadership inclusion in economic life by 2030. To know more about the eligibility criteria and to register for the program, please visit our website. If you go to our website, globalcompact.ca, and you go under the Program and Projects tab, you will find this information there. Now moving to today's webinar discussion topic, which is pay equity, an integral part of the gender equality discussion. Canadians have the right to experience workplace compensation practice that are free from gender-based discrimination. Pay equity aims to ensure that employees provide you with equal pay for doing work for equal value. On October 29, 2018, the federal government introduced the Pay Equity Act in the Parliament. We understand that the topic is complex, but a good preparation can ease the process quite a bit. To facilitate that preparation process, we collaborated with the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the Federal Pay Equity Office, to organize this webinar. We will discuss preliminary actions the workplaces can take for the coming into force of the Canada's new Pay Equity Act. While not yet in effect, the Act is an essential step forward towards achieving equal pay for work of equal value in federal workplaces with an average of 10 or more employees. To meet this purpose, the Act outlines proactive measures and puts the onus on employees to assess and set points in time whether employees in jobs commonly held by women are earning equal pay for work of equal value in their workplace. During the discussion today, you will learn from a variety of perspectives that will enable you to gain insights into how both employee and employer community are preparing to advance pay equity. To share their expertise on these topics, we are honored to have with us today Federal Pay Equity Commissioner, Ms. Karen Jensen, Mary Clark Walker, Secretary Treasurer, Canadian Labour Congress, and Derek Hines, the President and CEO of FETCO, the federally regulated employers. I'll first invite Commissioner Jensen to introduce herself and to give an overview of how you can prepare for the Pay Equity Act. But before we start our discussion, I would like to request you, in case you have any questions for our speakers, please go to slido.com and type in this number, W579, and you can post your questions there. Once all the speakers are done or have presented their content for today's call or today's webinar, we will have a question and answer session, and we will try to respond to as many as questions we can during the limited time. I'm going to keep the slide open for 1 minute so that you can go to the website and can go to the room so that you can start posting your questions as the speakers share their content. Slido.com, and the room number is W579. Okay, so hopefully you have that information. Also, Sandra or anyone from my team, if you can also post that information on the chat, I think that would be also helpful if anyone is joining later. Okay, so now going back to Commissioner Jensen, if you kindly share your insights on what are your thoughts about this proactive pay equity opportunities for the organizations, and what can they do to get the best preparation to respond to this act. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Ayman. It's a real pleasure to be here with you and everyone in the audience today. It was a very, very deep honor for me to be appointed Canada's first federal pay equity commissioner in 2019. I have a fairly lengthy background of working on behalf of unions, employers, and then as a third-party neutral in the area of pay equity, when that was very much a litigation-based approach that we used. And so I have quite a lot of experience with the challenges of pay equity in a litigation context. It used to be, and still to some extent is, that in order to have the right to equal pay for work of equal value enforced, women and unions had to bring a complaint. And this was then in litigation ensued. It was onerous, time-consuming, extremely expensive, and very hard on everyone involved. So I was really thrilled when the Pay Equity Act was passed by Parliament in December of 2018, and then I was subsequently appointed as the Federal Pay Equity Commissioner, because as Ayman said, this act takes the onus off of employees and unions to bring complaints and puts it squarely on the shoulders of employers to proactively examine their compensation practices to determine if there are inequities between work commonly done by women and work commonly done by men that is of equal or comparable value. And I'll go into a little bit more about that before I talk about how to prepare. Once the act is in force, it will apply to about 4,500 federally regulated employers with an average of 10 employees or more, which is about 1.3 million employees. And employers who are covered by the act will be given 3 years within which to develop a pay equity plan. A pay equity plan is the result of a process in which you do the following things. First of all, you identify job classes in the workplace. Those are positions that share certain similarities. Next, you determine which ones are predominantly female or male. Then you determine the value of the work done in each predominantly male and female job class. Then you calculate the compensation, the total compensation for each predominantly male and each predominantly female job class. And then you compare the compensation to determine whether there are differences between jobs of equal or comparable value. So the idea behind pay equity is that you can compare two jobs that are male predominant and female predominant that are very different. So you could compare a mechanic to an account technician, for example. Very different work, but if they contribute equal value, to the organization, then they should be paid the same. So that's how pay equity works. And the Pay Equity Act will require many employers to establish a pay equity plan in committee. that committee will be comprised of representatives, employee representatives, union representatives, and employer representatives. Those employers who have 100 or more employees or who have any degree of unionization in their workforce will be required to develop their pay equity plan in committee. And I'll be talking about how to prepare for that in a minute. The Act also includes requirements to maintain pay equity on a regular basis. And that's very, very important. The work is not done just once, but it has to be repeated and maintained. Increases in compensation that may result from the analysis are payable in full the day after the final version of the pay equity plan is posted. However, employers may be allowed to phase in the increases if the total amount of the increases is more than 1% of payroll. It is important to note that pay equity is something that is considered to be not only good for workers, but also good for Canadian business and for the economy. There's quite a lot of research that's coming out now that's indicating that for every amount of increase in equity, there is a commensurate amount of increase in revenue in companies. And there's some indication to suggest that when companies engage in a pay equity exercise, whether they're required to do so under law, such as the Pay Equity Act, or they do so voluntarily in other jurisdictions, they see that they are able to attract talent and increase retention in their workplaces in ways that are truly significant in terms of the bottom line. So we at the Pay Equity Division of the Canadian Human Rights Commission are working really hard right now to develop the tools that will enable businesses to fully implement the Pay Equity Act and will be ready to go by the time the Act comes into force. And I can get into that a little bit later. But I want to start now on discussing in more detail with you how you can prepare for the coming into force of the Pay Equity Act, which is anticipated to be this year. There are a number of different things that can be done in order to prepare for the Act coming into force. I think one of the most important things is that you increase awareness of pay equity. And I think that sometimes, in my experience of doing pay equity with employers and with unions over the years, this is one of the things that is not done to any great degree. Employers, in fact, almost have a tendency to keep it a secret that they're engaged in the pay equity exercise. And I think that's to the detriment of everyone involved, because I think the more awareness there is in the workplace about what pay equity is, and the more the myths around that are dispelled, the easier it is to get buy-in from everyone involved. Transparent, honest information to employees, to everyone involved about what the process is can only help, I think, to make the process more manageable. So that means providing straightforward information to employees about what pay equity is and about what the process is. Employees will need to understand how they will be represented on the Pay Equity Committee, for example, if the employer has 100 or more employees or there are unions in that workplace. They need to understand what the Pay Equity Committee is. They need to be, and for those employers where a Pay Equity Committee is not required, employers should also inform their employees that the pay equity exercise will be undertaken by the employer and that the employees may be involved in reviewing job descriptions and providing information about their job duties. An employer who's required to set up a pay equity committee should also set the foundation for that pay equity committee. They should be giving some thought to the size and composition of the Pay Equity Committee. The Act sets out the minimum requirements. 2/3 of the committee is comprised of employee representatives, that being sub-comprised of at least one member of each bargaining agent, and then one member who is appointed or elected by the non-unionized employees. And then the employer has at least one representative. But within that, there is some flexibility in terms of how that is, what the numbers actually look like. 50% of that committee must be comprised, however, of women. So that's important to note. It's also important to start thinking about the kind of training that you can provide and that the committee will be able to endorse in terms of training around job evaluation, compensation analysis, unconscious bias identification. It's very important that you start thinking about that. And if you're an employee and you're interested in pay equity and you'd like to put your candidacy forward to be on the pay equity committee, you may also benefit from training. And it's a good thing for you to come forward and identify yourself as someone who is interested in this kind of work. As an employer, you may develop internal policies around the time allocation. All employees must be given time at work with pay to undertake the pay equity exercise. And that's important for everyone to know. And as an employer, you may also want to consider how to support your employees who are not represented by a union in their election of committee members. You have to provide, as an employer, the opportunity for the non-represented employees to elect a representative. And that may happen online, it may happen in some other way, but that is your responsibility as an employer to provide that opportunity. Next, you may want to think about updating job descriptions, but do so carefully because that is something that may be of interest to the Pay Equity Committee. So if you're an employer and you have a Pay Equity Committee, you're going to have to work with the Pay Equity Committee around ensuring that the job descriptions accurately reflect the jobs that are being done. And that is not to say that the job descriptions reflect the work of the individual employees or the incumbents that you have in those roles, but rather what is an up-to-date description of what the role involves. So it's useful to begin to look at those job descriptions and whether they're updated. Also, as you're doing so, keep in mind that you should be using gender inclusive language. We sometimes find in job descriptions attributes such as aggressiveness, independence, courage, that kind of thing that might unconsciously be associated with men, and words like gentle, intuitive, that might slip into job descriptions that are unconsciously associated with female work. And it's important to look at that and ensure that your job descriptions don't reflect that kind of gendered language. Next, you might want to look into a job evaluation method. And here again, if you're an employer preparing to implement the Pay Equity Act, and you have to work with a Pay Equity Committee, you should be careful in the sense that any preliminary work you do to identify a job evaluation tool, bear in mind, it is the Pay Equity Committee that ultimately makes the final decision on the choice of method, not the employer alone. So that's something to bear in mind, but it is a useful exercise to look at the various tools that are out there, decide whether or not it might be worth considering developing your own tool. As many of you know, the Pay Equity Act, the Federal Pay Equity Act mandates one pay equity plan per employer, unless you make an application to the Pay Equity Commissioner for authority to build multiple plans, which is a separate issue. But if you're looking at a job evaluation tool, you may want to look at a tool that is capable of spanning the range of positions from executive level positions to entry level positions. And so that's an important thing. Finally, the last thing you need to do is to ensure that you gather the data that's required to develop a pay equity plan. That includes a list of job positions. It includes list of employees holding those positions, the gender, self-identified gender, including non-binary of employees, job descriptions, as I mentioned, the standard hours of work for each position. And if you don't have those available, you may have to look at tracking actual hours because the Act mandates an hourly rate of pay for comparison purposes. Then you need to compile a list of the compensation elements provided to each position. That would include hourly pay, commission, pay per kilometer, pay per piece, benefit plans, vacation plans, that kind of thing. And then finally, the salary range for each position, if that's available. Now, I know I've exceeded my time and I do apologize to my other co-panelists, but I'd be happy to answer any questions after we finish the panel.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Jensen, for your wonderful overview of how an organization can prepare for the Pay Equity Act. Next, I'll go and invite Derek to share his thoughts from the employer community on this act. Derek, if you please unmute yourself.
Thanks, Simon. Thanks for the invitation to join this panel. It's an honor to be invited, and thanks to all who've signed on today to participate in this important discussion. I actually feel quite privileged to share this virtual stage with two of my friends and colleagues, Marie and Karen. A little bit about FETCO, for those of you who don't know. FETCO is the largest employers association in the federal private sector. On workplace matters, we represent employers at some of Canada's largest airlines, courier companies, marine ports, railways, telecom firms, as well as others. And we represent them in relationships with the Government of Canada on a whole range of issues as it relates to the workplace. So first, I'd just like to sort of start my comments today with a few absolutes so that there are no misunderstandings between us on this call today. The male-female gender wage gap is real. Gender-based wage discrimination exists. Employers support pay equity. That is equal pay for the work of equal value. I agree with the Commissioner that pay equity can be good for business. To deny any of these facts is simply to have your head in the sand. However, I have a few qualifiers just to level set our expectations and to, I hope, give you an appreciation of where we're coming from on the issue of proactive pay equity implementation. Wage discrimination is not the sole cause of the gender wage gap. An argument can be made that it's not even the primary cause of this gap. And this may be a controversial thing to say on this call today, but I'll say there's little evidence that's been shown to date by the government to suggest that proactive pay equity is necessarily superior. Look, I'm not going to run from our past here. FETCO as an organization has questioned the introduction of a proactive approach to pay equity from the beginning. This was not so that we could be difficult, but because we believe the government has shown little evidence that this approach was going to be any more effective than anything we had tried previously. So what I would say at the outset is my recommendation is that we root our expectations of the Pay Equity Act in reality. Is it going to make a difference? Undoubtedly. Is it going to eradicate the gender wage gap? I don't think so. Is it going to reduce the wage gap better than any other approach attempted before? That we don't know, and I guess the proof's going to be in the pudding based on what we do as we move forward. But now a reality check. Before anyone out there assumes employers are going rogue here, let me assure you that while we still do at times question the potential efficacy of proactive pay equity in drastically reducing the gender wage gap, our members are religious followers of the law. Proactive pay equity is now the law of the land in the federal regulated private sector, and our members are fully committed to faithfully complying with this law and its associated regulations. We aim to be part of the solution here. And we have been involved in these discussions from the very beginning. We are pleased to be participating with the Commissioner in this tripartite working group that she has created. I think it's an excellent idea that she has implemented through her team, in which all the work that she is doing to help employers, unions, and employees prepare for implementation is being done really in an informed conversation style with key stakeholders at the table providing input to the work that she is doing that's going to be rolled out to be of, I think, great assistance. I want to spend a bit of time in my time with you today just speaking a little bit about some of the potential challenges that we see with the implementation of the Act and its regulations, and then update you all on what I'm hearing from employers as to what they have been doing to date to prepare for ultimate coming into force. So on the challenges side first, the first challenge, and this is not going to be a surprise to many of you on the call, and it's certainly not going to be a surprise to my co-presenters, but the requirement under the Act for a single plan is by far the primary issue that I hear from employers on. It is the top concern under the Act, that the Act stipulates as the baseline that each employer needs to have a singular pay equity plan. The members that I represent within FETCO are large, complex organizations. They have operations from coast to coast to coast in dozens, hundreds of locations. Most have multiple, some have many bargaining units and union relationships. From a compensation perspective, seeing this as one plan is going to be extremely difficult for large employers. This is not how large employers organize themselves when it comes to compensation. Many, in fact, would see it through different lenses, like union and union, or union and non-union, hourly pay and performance-based pay, or other methods of compensation, no risk and at-risk pay, executive and non-executive, region and region. So there are a whole bunch of ways I think that employers kind of see themselves when it comes to organizing compensation that is really going to be turned on its head if the requirement for a single plan is pushed forward for all employers. So it's going to be a real monumental task, I think, for most employers to do this. So not surprisingly, and this is not going to be a shock to the commissioner, employers are going to, if they are not already doing so, lean heavily on the commissioner and the latitude that the Act gives her to interpret situations where multiple plans might be permitted. So that's certainly an area where I hear a lot of feedback from employers on as being one of the key challenges. Another challenge is around the role of the committee. So Karen updated us all earlier on how the committee is going to work, how it's going to be structured. And our concerns around the committee, I think, are tied somewhat to the requirement for a single plan. Employers have a lot of questions about the role of the committee. There are some worries that committees are going to be too large and unworkable. If representation is required from all groups, and especially if this representation is to be proportional based on the presence of employees within the relative bargaining units. There are concerns about confidentiality. Committees are going to gain access, and Karen alluded to this, to an extraordinary amount of highly detailed compensation data. This is unprecedented. And though the Act requires a commitment to confidentiality, there are, some worries about this level of detail leaking out and potentially informing conversations at other tables, such as at the bargaining table, for example, in collective bargaining between management and union. There are concerns about decision-making within large, complex committees and the speed with which this can be done. The third challenge that I hear is around timelines. So the Act requires that a pay equity plan be established within 3 years of coming into force. 3 years may seem like a long time, but I certainly hear from employers who feel as though it is not. Now, I know there are 150 plus people on this call today, and that comment that 3 years may seem like a short amount of time is going to cause some eye rolls, particularly from some of my union friends who are on this call who have been fighting for pay equity for many years. However, what I'm hearing is that the complexity of this process is new, the change management significant. A lot of time is going to be eaten up forming committees, developing terms of reference, training committee members, and ultimately doing the analysis required to create that draft plan for review. And perhaps most significantly, seeking the commissioner's assistance when roadblocks emerge. Employers are concerned about what will happen if chunks of time in the process are consumed in negotiations, discussions, deliberations with the commissioner and her team. And our ongoing hope is that from a timeline perspective, the commissioner under her authority is able to grant some latitude here depending on how those processes unfold. So those are really some of the key challenges that I hear. In terms of what employers are doing to prepare, I have to say it's difficult to have this conversation in the absence of talking about the COVID-19 global health pandemic. I mean, clearly the data supports that experiences like a global pandemic have a disproportionate impact on women. No argument. It's also fair to say that the pandemic has had a major impact on the employer's ability to prepare. It will not be a surprise to me if many small to medium-sized enterprises are still in the very early stages of preparation. The pandemic and the response to it has been all-consuming. I'm sure as much on the union side as it has been on the employer side and on the government side. And the impacts of the pandemic have not been uniform across all sectors. We've seen sectors that have just been completely hammered by this pandemic, whereas others have survived reasonably well. I mean, I think this points really to the importance of the work that's being done by the Commission with Karen and her team, all the support material that's being prepared, the explainers, the legislative guide, the online pay equity tool, all of these things that are going to be rolled out to assist employers to hit the timelines required are really going to be helpful, particularly in the context of the world in which we're currently living and how we're all still dealing with the effects of this pandemic and the effects that it's having on the workplace. So what are employers doing? I'd say, first of all, in some respects, they're waiting. They're waiting for answers to some key questions. And that most important one is the one around single versus multiple plans. My sense is there's some element of feeling stuck until this particular issue gets resolved. How the work's going to unfold, everything dating back to the creation of the Pay Equity Committee hinges on this decision around whether or not a large employer will be permitted to have more than one plan. My sense is many large employers will be seeking the commissioner's approval to create more than one plan. Until then, until that decision is rendered, a lot of this work will ultimately be somewhat on hold. I mean, you can't strike a committee until you know the employee population that's going to be affected by that committee's work. So much of that work tends to flow from the single versus multiple decision. The next thing I'm hearing from members, from employers, is that many are, starting to get their compensation house in order where it is not already in order. As noted, the members that I represent are large and complex. They have sophisticated HR and compensation policies and procedures in place, and they have highly competent and dedicated staff in this area. My sense is many of them are taking the time between now and coming into force to, closely review the requirements under the Act. I'm sure many are doing as Karen suggested, reviewing job descriptions, looking at current job evaluation schemes, identifying any data gaps, and ultimately discussing strategies for a way forward with internal and external experts. The plan, of course, is as best as possible ensure successful compliance with the Act. The last thing I've heard from some of our members is they're starting to engage in some of those discussions with union and employee representatives, those who will ultimately be a part of forming the committee at some point once we come into force. They've started that work around ultimate committee formation. And how the committee might be structured, what its terms of reference might be, and what its approach to this big task might be. So that's what I'm hearing, certainly in terms of what many are doing. I do think that there's still much to be done. And we have been doing our part as an association over the past 2 years since the Act came into force to do as much as we can to help with the education of our members around what's in the Act, what the requirements are, what they will be expected to do once coming into force occurs. So hopefully that will help expedite these processes when we get moving. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Derek, for that wonderful sharing your wonderful insights and also kind of representing the employer community so broadly in this conversation. I am pretty sure the concerns that you have shared has been well acknowledged by the commissioner, and also it was great to see giving you an indication about how large organizations has already started preparing for this soon to be affected Pay Equity Act. It was great insights from you. Thank you so much, Derek. Now we'll move to our next speaker, Mary Clark Walker. She's the Secretary Treasurer of Canadian Labour Congress. Mary, it'd be great if we can hear from you, your insights from the labor community, and what are your thoughts about this Pay Equity Act?
Thank you so much. First of all, let me thank all of you for the invitation. I'm very pleased to be here with Karen and Derek to talk about the Pay Equity Act from the labor perspective. I am speaking to you today from the territories of the Mississaugas of the New Credit, and I am grateful to be able to work and live on this land. So 3 years ago, incidentally, on International Women's Day, the Canadian Labour Congress launched a campaign for women's economic justice called Done Waiting. The hashtag seemed the best way to express the persistent sense of frustration at the lack of meaningful progress on some of the key barriers that women were facing. We called for concrete action to end wage discrimination, and I would agree that it's not the only thing. Pay equity is not the only thing that can end wage discrimination, but I think it's a significant part of it. So we called for concrete action to end wage discrimination, to end sexual harassment and violence, and to fix the childcare crisis, demands that have been part of the labor movement and feminist movements for decades. If you've seen the posters or the share graphics for the campaign, you'll note that for each priority, we've portrayed the image of a woman who is clearly done waiting for change and resolved to see movement happen. So after decades of advocacy, even after a federal task force mapped out the components of potential federal proactive pay equity legislation, you can imagine that our patience had run out, especially with gender wage gaps the way that they were. And they weren't seeming to get any better. And yes, we say gender wage gaps in the plural because we know that wage discrimination impacts different women in different ways. And the gap is much wider for Indigenous women, Black and racialized women, and women with disabilities. And while collective bargaining has helped narrow those wage gaps in a number of ways for workers who have unions, that's in order to address stubborn and systemic wage discrimination and realize the right to equal pay for work of equal value. We also needed proactive pay equity legislation. Our campaign initially called on the government to ensure that promised pay equity legislation followed the recommendations of the 2004 Pay Equity Task Force, and I was proud to sit on that task force with a number of other folks. Our campaign initially called on the government to ensure that promised pay equity legislation followed the recommendations of the 2004 Pay Equity Task Force, and there were 113 of them. When the legislation was tabled, we called together pay equity experts from our affiliates and our allies and examined the bill using the task force report and the experience of unions in Ontario and Quebec, where they already had proactive legislation. In our initial reaction to the Act, the CLC raised a number of issues and concerns, most notably with language in the Purpose Clause on the formation and operation of committees and the provision in the maintenance section that appeared to contradict the recent jurisprudence. And we had hoped that some of these concerns would be addressed in the regulations, but it doesn't look like that will happen. After the legislation passed, the focus of our campaign shifted. We started calling on governments to address some of the gaps and loopholes in the regulatory process and ensure that the legislation is brought into force quickly and that the regulation and implementation work is done in the best interest of workers in female-dominated jobs. So we were happy when the legislation was finally tabled. And although we have concerns with the provisions, we are very anxious to see it come into force. We want to make sure that it does come into force quickly and that the regulation and implementation work in the best interest of workers in female-dominated jobs. I said that already, sorry. As I said, we were anxious and happy to see it come in to force so that employers and workers can actually start eliminating and identifying the pay inequities. As it stands, the timelines in the Act are quite generous, and I know that my employer colleague doesn't agree, but employers and pay equity committees will have 3 years to examine their pay structures and develop a pay equity plan, and then another 5 years to phase in any needed increases to compensation. Add to that 2+ years since the legislation first passed, and we're talking a decade. And I think that it's a very long time. The Pay Equity Act is a complex piece of legislation, and while we have yet to see the final regulations, the draft were pretty complex as well. Regulations should provide and really need to provide clear guidance to assist pay equity committees and employers in identifying and eliminating sexist wage discrimination. And we find that if they're too complex, it could pose barriers to implementation in some of the workplaces. Despite all of this, we do not believe that there should be any further delay in bringing the legislation into force. Resources and training will be crucial to ensuring a smooth implementation of this legislation. And when Derek talks about the timelines, I know that Karen and the Pay Equity Commission will be carrying out all kinds of education and training for not just workers, but for employers as well, so that they know how to implement all of this. So we're hoping that that will definitely equate into a smooth implementation of the legislation. And for this reason, sorry, Karen, we have very high expectations of you and the pay and your office. We have further urged government to ensure that the commissioner has a budget because we know that this work is not simple and it's not cheap. So you need a budget that's required to conduct robust tripartite training, as we just indicated, create resources and tools to promote the legislation and assist employers and committees in implementing it, and provide advice, assistance, and mediation and any other kind of supports that are required. Given the complexity of the regulations, there should be priority placed on developing plain language resources to help demystify the process for all parties involved, even those who have been working on it for, have been working on pay equity for decades. The language is very complex. We know that the commissioner and her team have been working really hard on a suite of resources and explainers, and we're very happy that they have formed an advisory committee of employer and labor experts to make sure that these resources meet everyone's needs. We have heard back from our affiliates that joint labor and management training was fundamental to helping build a common understanding of obligations, principles, and processes when the legislation was being implemented in Ontario. And we'd like to see similar initiatives at the federal level, efforts to bring worker representatives and employer representatives together to learn about their obligations, to understand the job evaluation process and their roles in the pay equity committees. While it's tempting to rely on online resources during this time when we're so dependent on digital space, there's a lot to be said for a more dynamic, interactive exchange of information, a chance for everyone to hear each other's questions and ensure a consistency of messaging and understanding as employees and workers prepare for the task ahead. Of course, many unions will also be working to help union members and leadership understand the pay equity process and their role in implementing the legislation. Some of our affiliates have already begun raising awareness about legislation internally and laying the groundwork to support members serving on pay equity committees. Others have begun some preliminary work mapping out the process, how the process should go. Much of this will ramp up once the regulations are finalized. The regulations thus far are silent regarding the formation and operation of pay equity committees. Quebec's legislation requires employers to provide training for employees about how pay equity works and to consider time spent on pay equity committees as work time. And I'm glad to hear from the commissioner that this will be the situation with the federal act as well. This was also a recommendation of the Pay Equity Task Force. These requirements would be particularly important for workers who do not have representation of a union. And while the new act requires that employers support the work of the committee, it's not explicitly clear whether training or pay for the committee's work time is required. We recommend that the regulations require both training and paid time for committee members. And I certainly hope that the employers present here have already made plans to provide these important forms of support. So once the legislation and regulations are being applied in practice, any clarifications, adjustments, or requirements for further regulations will become very clear. We have suggested that an early review of the legislation and regulations could help fill the gaps and clarify the process. In anticipation of this review, the government should establish a tripartite working group or reference group that could oversee the implementation process and make recommendations for revising the regulations and, if necessary, amending the Act. And we're glad to hear that this is also being considered. This could help avoid costly and lengthy litigation and expedite the review process. It's pretty remarkable, I think, and my colleagues may agree or may not agree, but I think it's pretty remarkable that the Government of Canada, the Canadian Labour Congress, and the Canadian Employers Council have all joined forces and all joined Equal Pay International Coalition, or EPIC. To me, this is a clear indication that all of the social partners in Canada want to put an end to systemic wage discrimination. Proactive pay equity can help, but for it to work, the process needs to be collaborative and transparent, and everyone needs to keep the objective of ensuring equal pay for work of equal value in mind. And remember, Derek, it's just one tool in the toolbox. So it's not the only tool, but it is one that can go very, very far. So if we're really going to narrow the gender wage gap, we also need to address other systemic barriers to women's economic justice. We need to fix the childcare system by building a system of universal, high quality, affordable, and inclusive childcare. We need to end harassment and violence, starting with the ratification of ILO Convention 190. We need to make work fair for women, starting with a review of the Employment Equity Act. All of this is extremely important. The COVID-19 pandemic, as my colleague already said, has only worsened long-standing, stark social and economic inequities. It's no secret that the gendered impacts of COVID-19 have hurt women the most, and you've heard that from my colleagues as well, especially those who face other forms of discrimination and marginalization. At the beginning of the pandemic, more than 1.5 million women lost their jobs. Many others saw their hours and income reduced in order to care for children or other family members. Women took on the lion's share of paid and unpaid care work, keeping homes, schools, and communities afloat over the past year. Since launching the #DoneWaiting campaign in 2018, the CLC has called on the federal government to value women's work, end violence and harassment, and fix the childcare crisis, as well as make work fair for women. 3 years later, it's taken a pandemic to underscore just how essential women's labor is to the well-being of our communities and to our economic well-being. Women's economic justice was a priority before the pandemic, but now we have reached a critical point, which means we have an opportunity now to get it right. Canada's pandemic response must center women's economic justice and must address deep disparities that have only worsened over the last year. So in addition to getting it right on pay equity, going forward, Canada's economic recovery must address the precarity faced by workers in the care economy, must invest in a universal childcare program, and must ensure that women who have been pushed out of the workforce get back to work in good jobs. So this legislation has to work for all women, especially women who are Black, Indigenous, racialized, or living with a disability. Next year will be 50 years since Canada ratified Convention 100 on pay remuneration. 50 years. Yeah, so we are done waiting.
Thank you so much, Mary, for representing the labor community in this discussion today, and also for setting up the expectations very clearly for the Pay Equity Commission and how the act should be rolled out. I think now we can move to the question and answer session, as we have already received quite a few, as I can see on Slido. So the first question that received the maximum attention from the audience today is, will Canadian Human Rights Commission offer training to employers or committee members to learn how to evaluate jobs and to be able to comply to the pay equity law? Karen, I guess that's a question to you.
That's a question for me. Yes, I can say we are definitely working on that right now. And one of the things that I'm really most proud of, I think both of our panelists talked about the work that we're doing in collaboration with the employer community and the union community, is the development of tools. And one of the tools that we're doing, Derek alluded to it, is an online tool. It's actually starting out as an Excel-based tool that will assist small and medium-sized employers to build a pay equity plan from beginning to end. But The other part of the tool is that we're developing a guide, and the guide will be a step-by-step process, laying out exactly how you follow the tool, but also how you could use it independently to learn about how step-by-step you implement a pay equity plan. And our thinking is that, first of all, we're going to use a case study. So people will be able to see how a fictional, but based on reality, a company would actually implement pay equity. And we're going to try and develop that into videos, short videos, so that that can be used in the context of a pay equity committee where both union and unrepresented and employer representatives can sit together around the table and follow the process through the video and figure out how the process works from beginning to end. There'll be other training materials that we will be rolling out over time, but I think another key component that people need to understand is that we are developing also an online dispute resolution platform that will provide employers and unions and non-represented employees with an opportunity to get information quite quickly. So for example, they're sitting in a pay equity committee meeting. They've watched the module on job evaluation. They don't quite understand some of the subtleties of that. They can send a question in on the platform and receive a timely response about that so that it can fill in the knowledge gaps. One of the things I really want to emphasize is that we understand the importance of timely information and training to avoiding disputes. And this ties in with something else that Derek said, which is that 3 years is not really all that long a time. And if the parties spend a lot of time fighting over issues like should this job be worth 520 points or 530 points, then it's going to be difficult to meet the deadline. So we as a commission are trying to provide the tools and the information to help employers and pay equity committees over this hurdle. But the committees are going to have to really focus on what Marie talked about in terms of collaboration. And I talk about it in terms of the 3 C's: cooperation, collaboration, and compromise, because it is just simply going to be too difficult to get through this complicated exercise unless everybody brings a certain amount of goodwill and willingness to cooperate and work together. We'll be there to support the parties, but this is proactive legislation. So the onus is really on the workplace parties to get it done and to get it done efficiently with the help of the tools that we are developing.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Jensen, for your detailed explanation on that question. I think that's really going to help everyone to start their preparation in a better way. And also, as you have mentioned, there are already a lot of resources that are available on the website. But then again, the platform that you've highlighted, I believe, is going to be really useful for them. The next question, I think, is, I believe, is for us. Will we have access to the recorded version of the session? Yes, we are hoping to upload the recorded version of this webinar in a week from now. And if you go to our website, globalcompact.ca, hopefully we'll be able to find this webinar under the relevant section. The next question I see here is, how can employees, and we have similar questions. I'm just going to read one from here. How can employers ensure they include all genders beyond traditionally male, female to include non-binary in the analysis? Who would like to respond to that?
I could start out and then I would welcome my co-panelists' thoughts on this. We are in fact developing a guideline for employers that would assist on this issue, because of course, there is an obligation under the Canadian Human Rights Act to ensure that there is no discrimination on the basis of gender identity or gender expression. So the Pay Equity Act needs to be read in conjunction with the Canadian Human Rights Act to ensure that gender non-binary individuals feel treated equally within this legislation. And the challenge, of course, is that the legislation speaks in terms of male and female predominant work. So we are developing a guideline, an interpretation policy guideline that will be issued that will allow people to allow employers specifically to address the situation of non-binary individuals. And basically what we're recommending is that those who are transgender, who identify as female, be counted as female. Those who are transgender identified as male, who identify as male should be counted as male. And those who do not, and there are increasingly more, who do not identify as either, they're gender fluid or gender non-binary. And those individuals, what we're looking at is the idea that those individuals would have the opportunity to opt as to how they want to be counted in that situation, whether they want to not identify as either male or female, or whether they have decided that they are going to opt as one or the other. So there needs to be choice there. It's a very complicated issue, and that's why we are taking the time now to develop a careful guideline around this, because of course there are questions around if someone doesn't feel comfortable identifying or feels as though they might be outed by the identification, that person's privacy has to be protected. So we are developing a set of guidelines for employers to use to ensure that the identity is protected of those individuals who don't want others to know what their gender identity is, and also how actually to undertake the pay equity exercise with a gender non-binary construct.
Thank you again, Commissioner Jensen, for your response to that question. Before I take another question, I think we have another 4 minutes before we close this panel. We also wanted to provide you this information, like in case, like let's say we are not able to answer to any of your queries, you can always reach out to the Pay Equity Commission, and this is their email address. You can respond, put your questions here, and hopefully they'll get back to you very soon. You can also follow them on social media and see what are the latest updates and the resources that Commissioner Jensen was highlighting during her presentation or the remarks. You can find those information on the website link that has been provided here. Going back to the questions, the next one, I believe, is again for Commissioner Jensen. Can management do the work, for example, job descriptions, and have the committee review and approve? Is there any opportunity or process for that? Or maybe Derek, you can also respond to that.
Yeah, well, I actually like to build on the question because I think it's a really good one, and it's one that we get a lot from our members. And Karen, I think, spoke to this earlier in her comments. Where's that line between how much work the employer can do to prepare, because that's ultimately what I think most progressive employers want to do, but not want to go so far as to start doing the work of the committee. So I would really be interested in Karen and Marie's perspective on that, because I think employers do want to do as much as they possibly can, but don't want to do things that then have to be undone once the committee is formed.
Yeah, I think it's important to recognize that, employers do have a responsibility to ensure that job descriptions are up to date and that they properly reflect the work that's being done. We know lots of employers have job descriptions from the 1960s, which are of very little value in the pay equity exercise. But having said that, once the job description is developed, it will be the subject of discussion, no doubt, at the Pay Equity Committee level, where the Pay Equity Committee itself may want to supplement the job description with a number of other ways of getting job information to ensure that they have the full range of duties. And that is a very valid undertaking on the part of the committee to ensure that the job description and the other information that's available not only fully highlights the work that's being done, but ensuring that it is fully capturing some of what is often overlooked female work. And this is really something that has been well documented in the literature, that there is a tendency to view some of the tasks that women may do, maybe cleaning up the boardroom at the end of a meeting. That doesn't find its way into a job description because it's considered just something that women do as part of their daily life. They clean up after a big meeting or a party or something. And instead of, including that in a job description, it's taken for granted. So that's the work that the committee will be looking at, is are there job responsibilities here that are expected of the individual, but that haven't found their way into the job description. So I'm always cautious about, one of the things that I'm really trying to communicate with employers is really, please do take this job, the Pay Equity Committee, as a collaborative exercise where you are not simply looking for approval or a rubber stamp to a plan that you have, but rather, as challenging as it may be, you need to take this as a joint initiative that you're working on together with the other people on that committee, together with the employees. It's not a rubber stamp process. It's something that is done together as a committee.
Right. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Commissioner Johnson and Derek, for your response to that questions. We are at time now, but there is actually one question that has been forwarded to me in private chat as well. I think that's very important. If you have another 2 minutes to respond to that. Does this Pay Equity Act apply in any way to private organizations or those with significant federal contracts? Can we just take 2 to 3 minutes to respond to this question?
Do any of my co-panelists want
Well,
to?
it applies to federally regulated private sector organizations pretty much exclusively. Those that are contractors, I'm not so sure. I don't think so. If they're provincially regulated, my read of the legislation, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, is that this is really focused on federal private sector organizations.
It is federal, private, and public, so the federal government is also included. Right. However, there is a federal contractors program that is administered through ESDC, and that there is an indication that the pay equity requirements under the Act will also become applicable under the federal contractors program for a certain amount of contracting with the federal government.
Right.
I would not be administering that, however.
Okay, great. Well, thank you so much, Commissioner Jensen, Mary, Derek, for your time today and for sharing your thoughts and remarks with our audience today on this very complex subject. But the way you have explained it, hopefully with enough collaboration, we can get through this process, and hopefully in Canada, we can ensure an effective implementation of the Pay Equity Act. From GCNC Canada, from Global Compact Network Canada, we are always here to respond to any other support that we may provide to the private sector. And we look forward to working with you. Thank you again for your time today. And until next time, take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.